don't fool yourself. Starting a remote team is just as hard as starting a regular team. It may even be more difficult to do because you have to take so many leaps of faith with the people that you're hiring.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Soulful CEO Path, the podcast for purpose-driven entrepreneurs who are building wildly abundant and aligned businesses that create ripple effects of positivity in the world. And this show isn't just about cookie-cutter tactics or surface-level strategies. Here, we dive into meaningful conversations that empower you to grow as a business owner and as a human. And I'm so excited to have the guest on that we have today because, fun fact, Jody was actually my first one-on-one client in my business when I launched it in 2016. So I had been coaching inside of organizations for a long time, but as in my own business, he was my first client and we worked together for I don't even know how many years, but it was a long time. It was one of the longest standing clients I had. So it is so fun to have him on the show today to talk about his experience in growing and scaling a company. And, Jody has a ton of technical experience that we could have gotten into around websites and web design. But I thought today's conversation, we'll see where it goes. But I think when it comes to building remote teams, scaling teams, building culture, Jody does a really great job of this and has navigated a lot of different variations of what that could look like. So that's where we're going to take today's conversation. Thanks for being on the show, Jody. Maybe let's just start to share a little bit about with the audience about your business and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've done a number of things over the years. I've been running the business for 20 years now, so
Yeah.
it has pivoted a number of times in that time. We are now really focused on the e-commerce consulting space. We started off originally in the web hosting space, providing a place for people to host their websites. That started to become very commoditized. So unless you were at scale, which we weren't at the time, it was difficult to make any real revenue at that. So we shifted into building e-commerce stores. And we did that for a number of years. We've been doing that for almost 15 years with Shopify, building out stores, helping people, create their place where people can go and buy online. Obviously, the pandemic was a big boom time for us where we scaled up quite rapidly. One of the things that we have recently discovered in the last couple years of doing this is that even though people have built sites, there is a lot of detail that are in running an online store. And so we are now moved more into the support role with these businesses in order showing them how to watch their numbers, make sure that they're not spending too much money on AdWords, making sure that that's being watched and managed correctly, showing them how to create revenue that is able to be recurring and not only building and running your Shopify store, but also being able to have a successful business. And so, I mean, one of the core things with all of the businesses all of the things that Sunbowl has always done is relationships have been at the center of that. Talking with clients last week, all of them said that the relationships and the communication that we do is the most important thing to them, and they're really happy with the way that we are able to share the complicated nature of running an e-commerce store, as well as bring the human component to it, so that they are truly partners with us, not just clients or customers.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that I think is such a unique differentiator, especially in your space where it can be quite transactional. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
that that's so cool. And then one of the things I think would be really interesting for people to hear about your story, because I think there's a lot of people that could relate to this, is because you've been in this, in doing what you do for 20 years, like you didn't start out as a CEO. You didn't start out with a team. You didn't start out like with this, bigger, maybe the vision, but you started out as an individual who was really good at something. And built a business around that. So can you tell us a little bit about your like personal journey from going from like solo, I guess like service
Solopreneur. Yeah.
provider to CEO of this company now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know how far you want to go back, but I did
As
start my
far as you
first,
want. Yeah.
my first company at 8 years old.
Yeah.
I was selling golf balls on a golf course. And so, when I was a kid, my parents both have an entrepreneurial spirit to them. My
Yeah.
dad had his own company, so I learned a lot of the business and the relationship from that. So I really never had a job in the sense, I did
Mhm.
work for the school board for about 6 months before I
How'd
pivoted
that go?
into it was an interesting experience. It really was. It was a union job.
Yeah.
So the
So polar
mindset was,
opposite.
yeah, it was the total polar opposite. And so, at 18 years old, I opened up an internet cafe where we had
Okay.
people come in and use computers. That was a transactional business.
What
As
year was that? Just to give context, 'cause that
some
sounds so
context around
foreign
that.
now. It's like, "Oh my why would you need an internet cafe?"
Well, that was in 1999.
It's so wild, right?
So,
Not that long ago, and, like, how different the world was. Yeah.
yeah, only was it, a quarter of a century.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I got out of high school in '99, and about 6 months later, I opened up the internet cafe. I originally had done a community project at the high school to run a community-run internet cafe where I was in Whistler, and there was a lot of visitors, and so they would come in and they would use the computer lab, and then we would charge them a certain amount of money for 3 hours to work in the lab, and it was a really successful program. And then when I got out of school, I was like, well, it's been so successful one night a week at the school. What if I was able to open up one that was 7 nights a week kind of thing? And part of the business model of starting that up was one, to do web design on the side, because that was a growing industry at the time, which would allow me to have the space to do the web design and pay for the rent and pay for the labor and pay for all of the overhead that was required, so that I had space to learn how to build web design. Because, like, at that time, you couldn't go to school for web design, it had just been invented. So, like, it was really, it was all self-taught stuff. Like, Google didn't even exist at that time,
Wow.
so you couldn't even look up stuff. You
How
had
old
to
are you, man?
I've been doing this for a long time. Yeah. So, like, I remember we used to have, like, Dave's big computer book, which talked about HTML and how to code things and how to build forms and all of that sort of stuff. So, yeah. So building that out, that pivoted into the web hosting company, because while we were there, we would build people's websites, and then, hey, we would need a recurring model so that we could, continue to earn income when we weren't building their sites. And that would be the maintenance of the site structures and stuff like that. And then what was that? This was the recession, the Great Recession. So when that all happened, anybody that we were working with that just had a website sales page, essentially talked about who they were. They all cut all of their, expenses, because with the housing crisis, nobody had any money for marketing. But the only companies that continued to operate were the e-commerce companies, because recessions generally are regional, and these people could sell in any market basically in the world. And so when a particular market saw a boom, they could see traffic coming from those people. And so that's when I decided to pivot the company from uh, web hosting over to e-commerce, because I thought at the time it was it was safe from any world events. The world tends to prove you wrong.
Yeah. All right. So that's where your current kind of business started. And then tell us a little bit about, like, what did that look like at that point in time versus what it looks like now in terms of the setup, like team, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, through my whole career, I've had some sort of help, employees or contractors. In the beginning days, a lot of it was on me to build. So I, would get a customer, I would build out their store, and then as I started to get more customers, I needed to bring on more people. One of the things that I really wanted to do, and this has to do with kind of like the gravity of an organization, is I really wanted to make it remote first. When I did this in 2010, remote first wasn't a term, but basically, I wanted the freedom to be able to travel and work from anywhere, and have all of the people who were also working for me be able to work from anywhere. And the reason I did that was because at that time, and still today, there are big tech firms, Facebook, Google, all of those companies, Apple, that can pay a huge amount of income to get the best talent. But what they don't offer is autonomy and flexibility, right? So you have to give up 14, 16 hours a day, but you get a great paycheck. And so what I realized was I could get high class talent who had been through that and didn't want to go back to working those long hours, but wanted the flexibility to be either able to travel, be able to work with their family, work from wherever they wanted. So it really opened up the market for who I was able to attract as talent. And so with that, obviously comes the challenges of running a remote team. But having that access to those people transformed the way I ran my business. So for a number of years, we were purely contractor based. We had people who would sign in, they would get their jobs, and they would complete them, and it was all results based. And when you have a remote team, you can't do it hour based, right? Because you spend so much time in oversight and checking in, or like buying mouse jigglers and stuff like that, that you can't really determine whether or not someone is doing the output that they need to do unless you are tracking it based on their actual output. And so my business model was, okay, you get assigned this job, you have this much budget to get it done. When do you think you're going to have it completed? They give us the due date so that they have autonomy around that due date. And then they go and they complete it by that time.
Yeah.
And you have to really give a lot of trust to those people. But because you're working with people who have, high standards of the way they work, they're very, very skilled. And they've come from organizations where they didn't want the big money anymore. They wanted the freedom. That freedom is so valuable to them that they're going to perform in order to create the best products possible.
Yeah. I just want to pause for a second and highlight how ahead of the time this concept was when you implemented it back when you did. Like now it seems just like, oh yeah, like so obvious. Like a lot of people are working remotely and there's a lot of yeah, it just doesn't sound as novel, I should say. But when you implemented it, it's like a totally new way of doing things and running teams. And I think that that's super cool to just one, acknowledge you and recognize you for, but two, you're speaking to something that's really important and you're talking about hiring people based on what they value. And you were able to identify something that you could offer, a unique differentiator in the market. Because when we're attracting talent, it's no different than really attracting clients. Is like
I
we
completely
have to
agree.
think about,
Yeah.
we're bringing on values aligned people, or we want to be, anyways. But unless you're really clear as the founder, as the CEO, as the organization on what your values are, it's really tricky to find those value fit people. So this way you got to hold the standard for quality, but also, meet them at something that they wanted, which was like the freedom versus the money, which is super cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so when you think about building a like what have been maybe a better question is like what have been your biggest learnings that if you shared could maybe save people time, energy, headaches around building a remote team?
I mean, that's a really great question. It's not easy. Like, don't fool yourself. Starting a remote team is just as hard as starting a regular team. It may even be more difficult to do because you have to take so many leaps of faith with the people that you're hiring. But I mean, it really comes down
Mm-hmm.
to in the early interview process to make sure that they're a good culture fit. You know, when I'm interviewing people, I'm talking to them about like what what do they like to do
Yeah.
in their spare time, do they what are the projects that they enjoy working on, and
Yeah.
I'm looking much more for, are they going to fit in with the people who are currently, I mean, growing up in Whistler, there's more than necessarily the mountains there called Interwest, and Interwest had this hiring policy is that we could teach skills, we can't teach attitude, and so you always hire for attitude. And so when I'm looking for people, I used to do my recruitment and I used to call it campfire recruitment, which basically when I would go and travel, I would sit around a campfire on a beach somewhere or in a location, and I would be talking to the people who were there. And as you're talking to the people, they're like, "Oh yeah, I do programming. I'm a digital nomad wasn't a term, but they're like, I'm working remotely and stuff like that. And I would talk to them about what it was that they were interested in. And generally in the early days, before we did any like actual like HR recruitment, this is how I got new people to the company. Is I would find people who were already doing the thing that we wanted to champion, and then we would bring them in and we'd give them a couple projects. We see how they work out. um, you know Lucky enough, I'm in a growth industry, right? So there is a lot of room to make um, bets and take some risk on people, so that you can see if they are a good fit. As we were scaling during the pandemic, and like, I mean, the pandemic really messed up a lot of things for a lot of people. We had to be recruiting people. We couldn't go and do campfire recruitment because we
Right.
couldn't leave, right?
Yeah.
So we had to shift to using recruitment agencies and using Indeed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that really made it difficult. It really did,
Yeah.
because
Tell
we
us
didn't
about the
have.
difference, like what you notice is the difference hiring through somewhere like that versus being able to be in person with someone around the fire.
Yeah. So the biggest thing that I found was we had to spend more time up front on the the test projects. The projects before we put them into production, right? So when we were meeting people in person, you had a better connection with them. When you're just across visual conferencing, it's really hard to understand what someone's motivations are, what they find, what they hold dear, all of those sort of things, because you know um, virtual conversations are very intention based, right? Like, you don't get on a Google Meet just to hang out with somebody, right?
Yeah.
And so like you don't get an understanding of like what the person is like in real life
Yeah.
when it's just by virtual conferencing. And so what we needed to do, we really kind of struggled through that period. And also too, like, I mean, as we were also scaling too, so we needed to bring on people
Yeah.
really really quickly.
So you
Since
had the
then we have
opposite problem during
we
that
had
time. Everyone
we
was
had
trying
the
to get
opposite
online
problem.
and have
Yeah,
shops.
everybody learned
Yeah.
that the internet existed.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so after that kind of settled down, we've kind of peeled back or pared back on the team members that we have here, because everybody's got their own opportunities now and they're going off. And having a smaller team is a better product in the end, because we
Hmm.
can work a little bit deeper on that stuff. And it's kind of part of the transition we've made to from using contractors more towards using employees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting conversation to have around the difference between contractors and employees because, for most people, when they get started, having contractors is a better option. There isn't the financial
Yeah.
commitment. You can
It's
hire
less risky.
fractional support.
I was gonna say it's less risky. You you
Yeah.
you put you put the risk on the contractor rather
Yes.
than taking on the risk yourself.
Totally. And you can get specialists for like, 5 hours a week versus having someone who might be more of a generalist and whatever. So, but there's things that come along with contractors. And one of the frustrations I hear from people often, and I know I've dealt with this myself working with contractors, is that the quality isn't always there. And you kind of churn through them. So, for example, it's like, you spend the time onboarding an assistant, they stay for about a year and then they're gone. And then you have to do the whole thing again. And then it's like this, ends up being quite costly in the end to the company. Um, so tell me maybe when you think is a good idea for people to make that shift from contractor fractional support to starting to build a team of employees.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know when the right time to do it is, but I can just talk about when I decided to do it.
Your
Uh,
way is the right way, Jody.
yeah, right. So, I mean, the transition for me really became clear to me when I started evaluating the risk, right? And when I understood that, like, the reason I had contractors was because I was mitigating risk for the projects that I was taking on. And what I realized was our projects had gotten to a point where they were big enough that regardless of whether I was using an employee or a contractor, I was taking on the risk. And so as the business owner, I was ultimately responsible for the success of the entire project. And so if I was using contractors to mitigate my payroll risk, my HR risk, my security risk, and all that sort of stuff, what I was ended up doing was I was ended up hurting the project overall, because unless you give a contractor a steady flow of work, they're going to be looking on other places for that, right? And one of the biggest changes, and I cannot believe how much this changed, was when I took someone who had been a contractor for 3 or 4 years, and then they became an employee, and the overhead of the cognitive load of like, where am I going to get my next job from? That is a very specific skill that you need to be able to be able to manage that. And when I switched those people from contractors to employee, their their productivity tripled. Like, it was like night and day difference. And it wasn't just one, it was every single one of them. And what I think part of that is because we invested so much time in the culture and making sure that, everybody felt included. Like, uh, I always treated the contractors as if they were employees. Obviously, legally speaking, they were contractors and
Yeah.
they always will be contractors. But treating
Just so
them,
in case anyone wants to come back and
yeah, exactly.
legally, just we're covered.
We are covered. We are totally covered on that part. But no, but treating them as like they were
Yes.
part of the team, right?
Yes.
And inviting them in. And when we made that switch to, okay, I'm now going to take on the risk of taking on employees, it was actually a downgrade in risk, because now I have people who are already invested in the way we were doing it before. They're already invested in working with the people here. And now they are given the security of knowing that they have a consistent job, and they're already performance based, right? And so, I mean, a big part of why our system worked is because I architected a system that was around performance based metrics, right? We can go into the difference between charging by the hour versus charging by the the project. But one of the big things that I noticed when I was looking at the data over the pandemic is we were working more and more and more and more, and we were getting more efficient at the stuff that we were doing, which means that if you're charging by the hour, you're in a deflationary metric, because what used to take you 3 hours to do is now taking you 1 hour to do.
Yeah.
And if you're charging by the hour to the customer, that means you've just decreased your income by
Mm-hmm.
3x, right?
Yeah.
And
There's
if
like no
I don't,
motivation for your people to actually do it faster because they're going to get, if they're contractors, they're going to get less money.
they're going to get less money. So
Yeah.
the incentives were misaligned.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that when I started, because we didn't have enough volume.
Yeah.
And as soon as the volume got to the pandemic level, it became very, very clear that the harder we worked, the less money we make, and the less happy the team was too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, humans are not robots yet. And
Yeah.
so like
Yes.
there's only so much work that they can do. So, making sure that they're doing the best type of work and having the space between the work is why we switched our model. We
Yeah.
completely switched our model into a value-based system where we have consistency across all of the projects that we work on. And that's why we don't charge by the hour anymore. It's now charged
Mm-hmm.
by the individual project, so that the employees that are working for Sunbowl don't feel rushed to do their best work.
Yeah.
Because how are you supposed to do your best work if you have a deadline of 20 minutes?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And so, there might be people who are listening who are like, okay, well, I may not be at that point yet where I have enough volume or have enough, um, you know, confidence that we have the workflow coming in to have employees. But what I think is interesting about what you're sharing is that even if you are working with contractors, there's a way to set those contractors up in a performance based model that can be a lot more effective than just paying by the hour and it being this remote person that you're like, maybe you work 20 hours a week, but you're actually getting like 8 hours of like productive time from them. Is set it up where they actually have metrics around whatever it is, the production that you're looking for them, and you align on what the compensation for that production would be at the beginning of the agreement. And then whether that takes them less time to do, then they're in the bonus for that if
They're in
they
the
get
bonus, yeah.
more, yeah, they get more
Because
skilled at it.
that's
um
that's that's another piece of it too, is that, like, we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about knowledge work, right? And knowledge work is the cognitive load. You really only have 4 hours a day to get this stuff done, right? Like, to do your best work, you can stretch it to 8 hours, but anybody who's working 8 hours on a spreadsheet knows that, like, halfway through, you're kind of done with trying to figure it all out. And so there's that component of it, which is like, if you're in a knowledge-based system, you have less hours of productivity in a day than if you're like in a manufacturing system where you are just doing repetitive work over and over again. So there's that piece of it. The second piece of it is from a motivation point of view, and this is kind of what you had just said there, is that like, as you got better at your job, you made less money, which is not an incentive to get better at your job. And so changing it so it was a fixed price. So I mean, I won't get into how we do it, but we charge based on credits, and a contractor at the time, or even now, gets paid a fixed amount for the number of credits that they process. If they want to earn more per hour, they need to process more credits per hour. So they can use their own efficiencies, and they can use their own methods in order to make those, $50 a credit. If they can do it in half an hour, they're now making $100 an hour. So it rewards people who are better at their job, and it kind of self-selects the people out. And so having that set up has really transformed the culture inside of Sunbowl to being a high performance based company, right? So it's early days. There was a lot of like, I don't want to call it laziness, but like, things just did not get done very, very quickly. And the best possible customer experience when it comes to the internet is speed.
Yeah, that's everyone wants it yesterday.
Nobody wants to wait for anything.
No.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, maybe that's where we'll go for the last part of our conversation here, is just around culture building and building culture on remote teams, because some people who are, listening this might be like, how is that even possible? And maybe it's not possible. I don't know. So that would be really interesting to hear your take on that around, is it possible to build a strong culture in a remote team? And if so, how do you do it?
Yeah, so I mean, we tried a lot of different techniques in order to get the team working together. And the thing we kind of landed on probably about a year ago is it takes really 2 check-ins a week. So early first of the week, we have a all hands meeting,
Yeah.
which is where everybody gets together and we talk through the projects, blockages. It's like a Scrum stand up where
Yeah.
we're talking through all of the things that people are going to be working on this week and all that sort of stuff. Then at the end of the week, I have one-on-ones with each person on the team. They're usually, well, I like to talk to people, so sometimes they can be 45 minutes, an hour. We generally, I book for half an hour to get into it. The good thing about that is that if they know that it's every single week, they have an opportunity to maybe get up the courage to talk about things that might not be super comfortable, because they're like, I can do it this week or I can do it next week, and that sort of stuff. So the consistency piece is there, right? The other piece of it too is that you start to get into a cadence of like, what happened this week. So typically what I ask is like, how was your week? Is there anything that was really great this week? Was there anything that was really challenging this week? What do you have planned for next week? Kind of check-ins. But it allows you to have that little bit more human connection with them, because like I said, because all virtual meetings that are scheduled with clients or other people are intention based, this was a check-in that is less intention based, and it's more about like, yeah, let's just have an open dialogue. And do we do them every single week? Most weeks, but some weeks things come up and you need to reschedule them for the week next week, and it's not a big deal because you just checked in with them the last week. And then when you get to the Monday morning meeting, that's the work based meeting. And selfishly, I feel good at the end of the Friday because I've checked in with everybody on the team and I've heard from everybody. So I can go into my weekend knowing that, like, okay, at least I've heard from anybody, and if there are any problems, I got 2 days on the weekend that I can figure it out for Monday. It also gives us this constraint where I can't hire too many people if I want to be able to have one-on-ones with every single person on a Friday. So it gives me this, like, genius is usually found within restraint, right? Like, necessity is the mother of all invention. And so if you have a constraint where you can only meet with 6 people or 7 people on a Friday, you're going to figure out how to make that work as you scale. And the thing that I've always had problems with is throwing more people at a problem, right? Labor cost, number one cost for any business. And it's how do you keep that under control without overwhelming your customer, without overwhelming your employees, while still maintaining a high work quality. And so that cadence that we're working on, where Monday mornings will all stand up, everybody gets to connect with each other, and then Fridays you connect with me so I can find out what's going on the front line,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's great. And so what it's really neat about that is like it's not this like crazy complex thing and these like reward and recognition programs that like these like big companies do, because I think sometimes that can feel overwhelming for people who have a small business. It's really just about talking to people and getting them together in real time, because I've been part of remote teams before where literally is never a time where the whole team is on the same call. And to me, it's wild. It's like, but it is tricky because it's like time zones and all that kind of stuff. But what I hear you saying is that there's like two non-negotiable or one non-negotiable where everyone gets together. And then the other time is like you have that deeper one-on-one check-in, and that alone allows you to cultivate a really strong culture that people are bought into.
Yeah, it gives me a pulse on what's happening.
Yeah.
One of my team member asked me, how do you always know what's happening with all of us? Like, I come to you and I ask you, you know, I've got this problem, this project's going on, and you always say like, oh, is that the project where this and this happened?
Yeah.
And they're like, how do you have enough time to do that? And
Yeah.
my answer to him was, I talk to everybody on Friday.
Yeah.
I ask them and they tell me. And so, especially with like new modern tools like Slack, which is so noisy, it's impossible to figure out. Like, there was a time where we hired people to just read Slack channels in order to create summaries so that I could read the summaries in order to make sure that everything in the Slack channel was going to plan. And like that was a huge amount of work. And what I realized after doing this for a while was if you don't have that many projects, you can just talk to the one person involved in the project and you can remove all of that complication, right? And like this is something that's talked about often with growing businesses, is the power of saying no. The hard part about saying no is knowing what to say no to, because some things are very, very close on whether you should say yes or no. Like a new customer, that sounds great, let's go yes. But like without knowing what your capacity is, that one customer can actually topple the whole thing, just by them being there and you're not focused on it. So I think as we have learned our culture and learned how to operate as a remote team, understanding what our limitations are is becoming one of our biggest assets, because it allows us to say no to certain projects so that we can have an emphatic yes when we say yes to
Mm.
another project.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole other conversation around like scaling and,
for sure.
scaling.
Scaling's hard.
Yeah, and like not just scaling for the sake of scaling, like more is not always better. And really understanding, like it sounds like you found your sweet spot in terms of these constraints. And yeah, it kind of allows you to say yes, know what to say yes and no to. So where do you see yourself in Sunbowl going from here? If you're kind of like maxed out in terms of your current number of team members and you're optimizing them, where do you see yourself going from here? Yeah, let's share a little bit around that.
Yeah, I mean, team members, how many we have on the team, that is at the limit that I want it to be at. But we definitely have huge amount of capacity to bring on clients, right? And so, we're working with clients that have a long-term vision for their companies. Often companies go through, I think Seth Godin calls it the dip, where you see an instant success and then it drops off a little bit and then it goes back up again. So we're focused on helping companies that are in that dip, because once you reach that success and you need to install processes and procedures, you need to refine your online offering so that it works. You got to make sure your lead funnels. Most importantly, you've got to make sure you have the data so that you're watching the right thing, right? And so where we're moving towards now as a company is working with brands and working with small business owners who have a great product, who have seen some success, and they're at that point where they're like, I don't actually understand why why I'm not making as much money. So essentially, the thing that we went through and we learned, we are now going to be teaching back to the people to try and help them up through that dip. And there's a lot of small things that need to be taken care of there. So For my team, I want to make sure that they have enough work to keep them busy so that they're engaged. I want to make sure that they have not too much work so that they're overworked and then they can still continue to travel. But I think the lessons that we learned from doing it remotely and doing it with contractors, which is kind of like starting business on hard or
Yeah.
on extreme level,
Yeah.
coming through to now doing it on a much easier level where we can all speak together, we can all work on the same projects, and we can work on stuff that is really impactful, and like we can look back and say that was some of the best work that I did in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that vision for the team. And, I think as business owners, especially, when I was working with corporate companies, one of the things I really wanted to support them with was creating work environments that allowed people to thrive as humans and individuals, as well as in their jobs. And it sounds like that's what you've really been committed to creating at Sunbowl. And I just think that it's such a beautiful mission because work is a big part of everybody, well, not everybody's, but most people's lives. And if we can make that time feel good and be expansive versus stressful, I think that can really just support the ripple effects of positivity in the
Yeah,
world. So
absolutely.
thank you for creating a space like that for your people. And if people want to learn more about Sunbowl and how you might be able to help them in their online, you know, journey, what are some good next steps for people?
So I've got a couple options for them. I mean, you can go and find me on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel.
Yeah, your YouTube, Jody's YouTube channel is great. Check it out.
Yeah, check that out. And I also have a online community, expertbymonday.com/community. It's a free community to talk about e-commerce. If you have any questions, you want to DM me, you just go to that community and you'll be able to talk with all the people that we have met remotely. So, it's not just the people in my company, but it's also the customers we work with, the partners that we work with. Everybody is included in that one community because as people move around and change companies and stuff like that, I found it very difficult to keep track of where their email was.
Yeah.
And so having a central place, which is, specifically for that kind of networking and to protect the asset, which is the people.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would invite people to go and check that out. That's probably the best place to start.
Okay, great. We'll put both of those links in the show notes so people can find that super easy. Thank you for being on the show, Jody.
Thanks
It
for
was great
having
to have
me.
that conversation and
It was
just kind
wonderful.
of get some insight into this, the level of business of scaling with team and what it takes and how, just like other levels, it is a ongoing nut to crack. And it
It
sounds
is.
like
Yeah.
you're getting there and you've gone through many evolutions. So your story is super valuable. So thanks so much. And thanks you for everyone who's listening. As always, if you have any key takeaways or insights that you want to share, connect with me on Instagram at Kristin Constable. And as always, if you feel inclined, please head on over to the show and give us a subscribe or a review. It really does do wonders to help the show get seen by more people. So we'll see you in the next episode.